information about those. Tonight's presenter is the author of numerous articles and books, one of which we have for sale after the talk. A former professor, she's taught courses in anthropology and sociology, research and writing nonfiction and memoir. Here to discuss her latest publication, Both Sides of the Pond, My Family's War, 1933 to 1946, please welcome Barbara Kent Lawrence.
Thank you for setting this up. Thank you for being here. It's so nice to see old friends. And I was thinking about where is home, and actually home is really here. I first came here in 1948, and I fell in love with Mount Desert Island and with Northeast Harbor, and I haven't lived here in quite a while, but it's still where I feel centered, and I appreciate that you're here and also that I'm here. So I'm going to tell you the story of this book, and I thought I'd start by reading very short passages to sort of give you a sense of what's going on. But then I'm going to talk about the mysteries of doing the research for this kind of book. I don't think I'm on a mic. Okay. Okay, it's fine for me. Is it better for you? I know, sometimes. Okay, is that better? Testing, testing, testing. Okay. I feel like I've fallen into the mic. Okay, is that better? Okay, well, hello again. Here I am, and I'm going to read two short passages. One by my uncle, obviously written by me, but about my uncle and his words, and then the other about my mother, just to kind of center us. So this is Kent in Cornwall, and that's my uncle, that's my mother. This is January 1941. We're stationed in what is now the front, Cornwall. I look across the ribbon of ocean towards the French coast and see the enemy in my mind's eye. I hear the sounds as we fled through Belgium and France. Children screaming and bellowing cows, their udders straining to hold milk no one will ever drink. Farmers and their families diving under lorries or into ditches as the planes swoop like hawks. We expected invasion after Dunkirk. Now winter blocks invaders from crossing the channel, but I fear the spring. Mother, father, myself, I can bear to lose. But not my sister, not my little sister. I can't think of her in some goddamn German brothel. No, I was right to tell her she must go to America, because she, out of thousands, no, tens of thousands, can escape to find a new life there. But it will be a life without me. Chin up, you old sot. You have your men to look after, and perhaps Flora. Who knows where we'll be when this ends, together or alone, or dust in a field of poppies. So that's Kent. This is Barbara in London in January 1941. Everything I love is in this room, this tiny light gray room with two small windows overlooking the communal garden, or what is left of it. I remember majestic delphiniums and dancing daffodils, but this summer there were just little plots of vegetables, carrots, so we see well at night, turnips and cabbages for the long winter. No flowers, except for Mrs. May's bleeding hearts to remind her of her son, and the ugly humps of a few Anderson shelters. At dusk, I pull down the blackout curtains. Around me, photographs of Kent and Mummy, Father and our Scotty Mac, photographs of my darling Joe, one on my bureau, the others tucked in drawers. The designer's sketch of the wedding dress for the first movie I had, in which I had a starring role, Wedding Group. When will I wear my own wedding dress and walk down an aisle to meet the man I love? Will I love? Someone else, I mean. Tomorrow I will leave everything and everyone, except for him. I'll run away to a new world if I survive the journey. Will he be there? So that's kind of where they were in January of 1941. I found this photograph in 2007. My parents had died when I was 30. They were both young. They'd been divorced for many, many years, but they coincidentally died at the same time. And I was simply too young at 30 to care about what they had done before I was born. I think one tends to be very self-centered before one gets older. 55 is about the right age. This is my son, Michael, who's also my brilliant editor. So I found this photograph, and I was stunned by it because they looked so beautiful, but also so innocent. And I knew where they were headed because they were headed into war, but they didn't really know. They thought it was a war that was going to be very short. One thing to point out is Barbara Greene, who's spelled with an E at the end of her name, and her brother's Kent Green is not, and that was not a typo. There is a typo in here. I hope you don't see it. But she was an actress. She actually turns out that she was rather a well-known and good actress, which we had not known when I was a child. And her new agent thought it would be better if she had an E on the end of her name for reasons nobody really knows. So what I'm going to talk about is the part of the research and the story, because when you start a family story and family research, it's really, it's like a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, and some puzzle pieces are there, but they're from a different puzzle, and you really have no idea what the picture is supposed to be. So I thought I knew things that it turned out I didn't. They were wrong. But I thought I knew from my grandmother, primarily, my mother's mother, that my mother was an actress. She fell in love with Joe Kennedy Jr., who was the son of the American ambassador. He wanted to marry her, but he died in the war. That was the first thing. The second was that she escorted 15 refugee children to the United States, and then she learned how to fly a plane, and she flew around the United States raising money for Bundles for Britain. And I knew only that my uncle had been rescued from Dunkirk, and I'm going to assume this audience knows what Dunkirk was about. Not all do, but, and that then he was in the airborne. So that was what I thought I knew. The first thing I did was to look up to see when Joe Kennedy died. And he died on August 12th, 1944, and I was 18 months old then. So there was something rather wrong with Granny's story. And I spent the next 6 months trying to figure out, trying to establish that my mother had actually traveled with 15 children who were refugees, bringing them to the United States, and I found absolutely no evidence that that had happened, which was obviously disappointing. Now here is the test for Martha, which is my uncle? I did this test on my son-in-law, and he said, look, I never met the man. How am I possibly going to know? And I showed him this picture, and you may not be able to see it as well as, okay, not you, but the picture. Who do you think it is? You got it. Michael, my son, looks very much like my uncle, and my son-in-law picked it out immediately. This was a family photo. I had it. Later, when I went to England to do research, I found a man who was a military photographer, analyst of photographs, and he's the one who wrote the names of the other people around there, some of whom look a little inebriated, but these were all the officers with whom my uncle served in Cornwall. But I didn't know where he, in what organization, what part of the military he'd been in, or where he served, was he drafted, all of these things. I had no idea at all. So I started poking around, and the first thing I did was find a thing called Unit Histories that was run by Hans Huderman, and I sent him information about my uncle, and he wrote back, well, I found him, and he was with the Royal Army Service Corps, which was basically the supply corps, and he rose to be a temporary major. That was a shock, because what I knew of Uncle Kent was that he was an alcoholic, He was a thin wastrel of a man, and he never was a success after the military. So to find that he had risen in the ranks was a puzzle in itself. And I think today he would have been diagnosed with PTSD, but because he had seen a lot of action. And then through WW2 Talk, I found this wonderful man, Ian. And Ian had was in the military, was with the Navy. He was also on the Navy rugby team, which you can probably guess from looking at him. And he was just a wonderful guide. And here we are in 2012 at one of the museums. But he said, "Okay, Barbara, you have to send a letter to the Ministry of Defense and ask for your uncle's medals and for his history, and it'll take 8 months, and 8 months to the day, things showed up." And I've got a facsimile of this and some other things you can look at later if you'd like. But this was his officer's record book, and it's a treasure for me because he carried it with him throughout the war. And it also told me many things about his service and where he'd been. There were also probably 14 pages that looked like this that were basically unintelligible to me. And I found a woman named Bex Skinner, who was an archivist with the Airborne Museum, and she and her team deciphered the records. For instance, SOS is a military acronym, then it means struck off service, not come rescue me. And so they helped me understand that he had served he'd served first with the British Expeditionary Forces in France and Belgium until they were pushed out by the German army. And then he'd also served in North Africa and in Cornwall, as I mentioned, which was the front. He was looking. In fact, I found records that say you could actually see the bombs going off in France from Cornwall. I'm not sure I believe that, but, and other people I found didn't either, so I didn't put it in, but he served in France, Cornwall, North Africa, Italy, Burma, and the UK. So that was a major source of information. I found that he enlisted on September 12th, which was only 9 days after the war started. And he was too old to be drafted at the time, so he had really made an effort to be of service. And he'd had some military training in a private school, it's called a public school in England, and was assigned to the Royal Army Service Corps. And I found things like the war diaries of his commanding officer in all of the different times he served. Excuse me. And this one, actually, it's hard to read. You know, I don't really want to turn the lights down lower, but it does mention him and what he's doing and something that he's been assigned to do. And then this is kind of poignant because this is saying that they destroyed all of the war diaries for May because they were afraid that the Germans would get them. And so that we don't know what they experienced in Dunkirk, but I found a man named Philip and Malins, and he had been a driver driving trucks in Dunkirk, and he had been in the same unit as my uncle. In fact, my uncle was his boss, and so he was an enormous help, and he had risen to be a major himself, but he shared memories and documents, and I relied heavily on him, and I was supposed to see him in England when we visited, but he got very sick, and I wasn't able to, and he died shortly after, so that was really devastating. But they escaped to a place called La Panne, which is a beach near Dunkirk, and as you can see, it shelves off very gently. And so they came up with the idea, somebody did, of taking the lorries that they were leaving, the trucks they were leaving, and they were disabled, and making this jetty out into the ocean so that the men who couldn't swim, because many of them couldn't, had handholds. And so the little boats came to get, the little boats that came from England, which are well known, were coming to sort of the ends of these jetties to take the men to the Navy ships that couldn't get anywhere near the shore. And they went through absolute hell, and we know that, and I won't describe that further, although we do a bit in the book. And my grandmother, again, family stories, my grandmother thought that Uncle Kent, her son, was in the airborne and was dropped into France, and she had been terrified. I guess he never told her that he was invited to the 6th Airborne, having served in the 1st Airborne. There weren't any 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 5th Airbornes. That was a ruse to convince the Germans there were more airbornes than there were. But Uncle Kent served as the chief trainer of people in the RASC who were going to be with the airborne, and eventually he ran that outfit, that base. So here is something that Bex Skinner, this wonderful woman in the airborne, found for me, and she interpreted. It's his record of parachute training. And parachute training sounds awful enough. You had to dangle from these braces, but the worst thing was that you had to drop into the air of a very powerful fan and be tossed around. Anyhow, he did it. But he never did it in anger in the war. And later, and I'm focusing just on him now. He was sent at the end of his service, or towards the end of it, he was sent to Burma, and he had fought in Italy, and one of the primary problems of delivering anything in Italy was getting it into the mountains, and the way they did it was with mules. So he goes to Burma on a 3 months, command to do something, and I talked to many, many people, and I said, what was he doing there? And the consensus was that he was trying to figure out he was trying to learn from people who were fighting in Burma how to serve people, how to supply people in the mountains. And the primary thing they were doing was parachuting mules. And here is this poor mule who's been parachuted. He gets drugged first. I found a wonderful veterinarian up in PEI who knew, named Dr. Sharon Craigier, and she had known Major D.H. Witherington, who was in charge of this program, and so I got these pictures from her. The heartbreaking thing for me and for the men who were working with these mules is that most of them were slaughtered at the end of the war instead of being brought home, and they had served with great courage and gallantry, these mules. So that was very unfortunate. But so he had a very strange career in terms of what our family had actually thought. It was very, very different. And he'd seen a lot of combat. And he never told anybody. When my cousins in England read this book, I said, we always thought of him as this alcoholic who never, couldn't have done anything in the war of interest. And the way that I figured it out was that all of the military people, and there were quite a few of them, would say to me, if you read his record, and he must have really done a fantastic job. But I think it also took a fantastic toll. So we're going to skip now to my father. I had only these 3 photographs of my father. My mother and father, I'm sure this is their apartment in Harmony Street in Delaware, where I was born. And then my father is the second from the left, and he had a plane. He was captain of a plane, and he flew bombers to the United States, from the United States to Great Britain. And my mother was back here, so it was sort of strange. But he had wanted to be a fighter pilot, but his eyes simply weren't good enough, and so he did that. And then I searched for his records, and I expected to find the same depth of material that I found with Uncle Kent. But unfortunately, his records were lost in this terrible fire at the National Personnel Records, and that's in St. Louis. And that happened on July 12th, 1973. So they were all gone, and all I got was this one piece of paper that said, yes, he served, and he was discharged honorably. But I did find this book about the Second Ferrying Group, which was the one that he was a part of. And I found that he's mentioned, and that he was in the Newcastle Army Air Force Base and in charge of this air traffic control tower, and had 5 people working for him. Never knew that from him. The only thing I remembered is that one day we were in Cape Cod, and I was about 3 years old, I think, and I was taken to an airport, and my mother said, "That's your father's plane." And so I thought he owned it. You know? I don't think he did. He might have borrowed it for the day, however. So I wanted to learn about my mother. This is the earliest picture I have of her, but I wondered, what was she doing before the war? And did she really know Joe Kennedy Jr., or was that just something that somebody made up? And why did she go to the United States? And how did she get there? And when? And what did she do before she met my father? And I had a lot of family photographs from her films, and really little else. So I started looking around, and the first thing I tried to confirm was that she had been a student at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. And in 2012, I visited RADA, as it's called, and I found that, yes, there's her name right there in their book of the people who were signing up and signing in. And I also found that she'd won I don't know if you can read that, but she had won a scholarship. And my family didn't have money. She came from sort of lower middle class, somewhere in there. And so she couldn't have had the money to go to RADA unless she'd gotten a scholarship. And I also found a playbill where it said that she was the star of the show. So that all fit together neatly, and that was nice. She had also told the story that she discovered James Mason, and she chose him for a movie over Rex Harrison. Who knew? It seems it actually was true. And here they are in I think it is a dreadful movie, but I haven't actually seen it because all the copies have melted. And what is funny to me here is that here's this little squib about young talent and blind man's bluff, but at the very end, they call it blind man's buff, and which conjures up very different kind of scenes. But it was a ridiculous movie, but it was, it was a start. She was also in this movie called Wedding Group with Patrick Knowles. And this one I have seen, and it was wonderful. It's about the Crimea, and she's 17 years old at the time, and she plays a 21-year-old who goes off to rescue her man in the Crimea. And it's actually a really good and rather exciting movie. And I was taken to see it when I was 5 years old, because it did get to the United States. I had no idea why I was there. And so I'm watching it, and all of a sudden there's this woman, and she's writing something, and I recognized her handwriting, and I said, "That's my mummy," and very loud voice. And so everybody laughed, but I was excited to be able to see it and actually have a copy. And then there was a mystery, because we have probably 100 photographs of my mother in costume, rather elaborate costumes, but I couldn't find that she'd actually played in this movie. The Great Barrier wasn't ever released. And I was online a lot, and I found a man who was a great fan of Lily Palmer, and some of you may remember the name Lily Palmer, but she played the other female lead. And this man was saying, Lily Palmer is fantastic in this movie, but the woman who plays opposite her isn't very pretty and isn't very good, and she shouldn't be in this movie at all. And I thought, that's my mother. And so I got in contact with him, and together we figured out, no, it was not my mother. For one thing, he sent me a copy of the film, and I thought, no, this is somebody totally different. And I couldn't figure out what had happened. And I managed to find a guy named Clive Polden, who worked in films and theater in England. And he he said, you know, she was a very accomplished actress. She was, you know, a young starlet, but uh, she was known, okay? And something happened. They don't pull somebody off of a movie if it's going well. And so again, I hunted and hunted and hunted, and finally I found that what had happened, and found this from an ancestry resource of newspapers.com, and I found that what had happened was that the director of the movie had had a nervous breakdown, and so everything was delayed. And that mattered because she was under contract to play opposite Ignacy, I'm not pronouncing that correctly, Ignacy Paderewski, who had been Prime Minister of Poland and was a pianist. And this was really not a great movie, but because of him, it was widely distributed. This happens to be a poster that I found from Argentina. Now, you're laughing, which is good. So there she is in this Argentinian poster. But the world was changing. You know, we're now in 1937, 38. Hitler came into power in 33. There were all sorts of signs that things were not going well, although the British public was shielded, or shielded is not quite the word, but it was the purpose, shielded from knowing what was going on in the rest of the world. And she made some other movies. This one did surprisingly well. He was a comic, and she really didn't want to do that movie. And she made a television show, and then I found that she went into the theater. And that was important because the granny story, again, was that Joe Kennedy was a stage door Johnny and had fallen madly in love with her, seeing her in a play. So I was able to correlate when she was in a play with when he was in London. And it's January 12th, 1939. None of this can I absolutely prove, but the circumstances are pretty solid. So they met. And now that's really hard to read. Can you read that at all? Okay. Well, I can't either. But what she's saying there, this is a letter. By this time, the war is, you know, it's really there. And in 1939, this comes a little after she had met him and they'd had a romance. She went down to France and stayed in their chateau until August 8th, when the war was really heating up. The Germans were starting not in Poland, but in areas near there to invade. And but really nobody was going to southern France from Britain, but she went because that's where Joe was. And so the story was starting to build. In fact, she had been in love with him. And in this is a letter from my mother to Ambassador Kennedy after they'd had lunch. She at that time was working as a nurse, kind of a CNA level nurse with the Voluntary Aid Detachment, and it was part of the Red Cross. And this letter says, I have to admit that I'm in love with Joe, and I hope I always will be. But there's also the tone that I know I won't be. I mean, she knew she wasn't Catholic, she wasn't American, she wasn't rich, and so this was not a romance that was going to survive to marriage. But I worked in the Kennedy Library, which was so much fun, for about a year and a half, not every day, but many, many days. And this letter, I found 3 letters, and they're in the book, but the first was my mother saying, I'm so sorry, I can't come to lunch because I have to work. And being comfortable enough to say to Ambassador Kennedy, okay, this is not a command, I can't get there. But then he said, no, I'm sorry, you have to come this day because that's the only day I can see you. And she shows up and she writes this second letter about how she's in love with his son. And by the way, thank you for the strawberry shortcake, because that's what she had for lunch. And then there's this letter from my grandmother, my grandmother was such an obvious social climber that she really was kind of a hoot. She just, we had to laugh. I went out with somebody who was very wealthy for a while. I was 16 at the time, and my grandmother said, if you can hold on to him till you're 21, he might marry you. Of course, I broke up with him. So anyhow, Granny's letter was this, it went on and on about how grateful she was for all the flowers that Ambassador Kennedy was sending her. Anyhow, and here's a telegram. It always feels a little poignant to me when I read my own name, Barbara Lawrence, because that's who she was then. But this is after Joe died, and I found this also at the Kennedy Library, along with their cleaning bills and letters to famous people, and they saved everything, which was wonderful. So, no, he died, yes, he did, yes, yeah. Um, the other question I wondered is, where did she serve? What was she doing? And I found that she had served in 3 different hospitals. The records for women were not nearly as strong as the ones for men. And, but I had help from people in England. We identified that it was very likely that she was at RAF Croydon, because I won't bore you with all the details of that, but that's where we think she served. And partly it had to do with the fact that she suffered hearing loss from a bomb, and that we knew. And she was serving as a nurse, and she was very interested in the planes. I think it's one reason she then later flew a plane. So this is the record of all the bombs from this one bombing of Croydon Airport. And then the reports from the newspapers about it. And the other question was, how did she get to the United States? Because if you were between the ages of 16 and 65 as a woman, you weren't allowed to leave Great Britain. And so you could only do it if you were bringing refugee children. And so I tried to find how she had gotten from the UK to the US. It had to be on a ship, and Ancestry.com has all of the ships and the passenger lists and then the manifests when people got off the ship and on to wherever they were going. And I couldn't find her, and I went, it took forever, and I got really fed up with myself, and because I knew her name and I knew her birth date, and I put that all in exactly on Ancestry, and I couldn't find her. So I did find a guy named Roy, who was in the Merchant Marines, and Roy Martin, and he said, Barbara, just leave everything off, just put in her name and that she was British. And I scrolled through pages and pages. You wouldn't believe how many Barbara Greenes there were. And finally there she was, and there was an entry in Ancestry that said she was on the Warwick Castle, this ship, and you'll notice that the ship, at one point, it was a Union Castle ship, and it was a really elegant ship it was a mail ship that took the mail down to South Africa, but it was requisitioned by the Navy and changed radically. But at the time my mother was on it in January of 1941, it was still elegant on the inside and gray on the outside. And so she's listed here. Again, it's not easy to read. Of 2 grandmothers and 3 grandchildren. That's not 15 refugees. It took me quite a long time because I was too cheap to print the entire manifest out. I thought when it said cabin class, it meant, kind of cabin down there somewhere in the hold, which is what the people who were taking refugees, where they would have been. When I finally printed the whole thing out, I realized it was first class, and there's no way she could have afforded that. And she also was very near. And I found out later that where you were on the passenger list indicated where you were on the ship. And so she was very near Lord Halifax, but Lord Halifax wasn't on the ship with his party, and that was another mystery. Again, I found something else that showed me that there was a letter that said that he decided to go get to the United States after he'd been appointed ambassador by Churchill, who frankly wanted to get rid of him, wanted him out of the country. and that was a handy way to do it. And again, here's another manifest, and this is showing that she was sponsored by Ambassador Kennedy. She's a friend of Ambassador Mrs. Kennedy. They gave their address as Rockefeller Center. So they sponsored her to the United States. And they created the ruse that she was traveling with 15 refugee children, which fit because Kennedy had started a group to evacuate children. She told that story to the end of her life. I never knew that actually she had traveled with these people. I was able to find these people and have gotten to be friends with them. There was one of the grandchildren who was still alive, and I wanted very much to meet her when we went to England. And I was told she was sick and I couldn't. I found out very recently, and this makes me very sad, but I found out that when this child was brought to the United States with her brother, who was several years older, 5 or 6 years older, she was put into foster care and she was abused when she was there. And so it was devastating to her, and she never recovered from it. But the family was otherwise very welcoming and told, we've shared stories about them, and they were in the film business, and that's part of the reason that I'm sure this connection was made. So I think this might have been the smartest thing I did in all of this research, which was, I thought, well, if I can find somebody who was on the ship, who was male, so wouldn't have changed his name, and who was young, but old enough to remember something, and had a weird name, I might be able to find him. And there he was. He was Humphrey James Martin Smith, age 12, and he was in a stateroom very near where my mother was. And I Googled him and found him and sent him a letter. And about 3 weeks later, the phone rang, and I picked it up, and this man with a very British accent said, "Oh, be gobsmacked." And I thought, I'll be what? But gobsmacked is a perfectly good British word. And we got to be friends, and there we are together. And he showed me he had all sorts of memories. One was that they hadn't eaten a banana for several years because bananas were not supposed to be brought into England because they took up so much space. And so the kids on the ship, when they first saw a banana, were thrilled. I also talked to a member of the aristocracy who was on the ship, and he had exactly the same reaction, bananas. Jim also did this drawing, this map of where the ship went, and I was able to correlate that with a man who is a weatherman and who told me what the weather was when they were there. So that was very helpful. And towards the end of the research, I said, okay, I got stuff from Ancestry every once in a while, and this came from newspapers.com. And it was, guess what? Now we have the Palm Beach Post. And I thought, I'm almost finished. And I thought, no, you have to be diligent. So I looked up my mother's name, and there it was, saying that she'd arrived on February 1st in 1941, which was only a week after she arrived in the United States. And then she'd been there for a week, and where was there? Well, there was the Biltmore in Palm Beach. The Kennedys were there then, and they were putting her mother up at the Biltmore because they had somebody staying in their house who was ill. And so my mother, again, it's circumstantial, but she could not have gone there, would not have gone there if there hadn't been a connection with the Kennedys. And what did she do when she was there? Well, again, the family story was that she was a model, and she got a modeling job. And I found a book by John Powers, who was the guy who supposedly had hired her. And there she is, but her name is only Barbara Kent. And it turns out, again, a little more research, but it turned out that she had been auditioned for the lead in a play called RAF, and by a British producer who liked her very much. He didn't get the funding for it, so it never went anywhere, but they changed her name to Kent because it was so clearly British. So there she is, modeling in her book. And she was a very brave woman in many, many ways, and writing this book has helped me understand that and appreciate her a great deal, which I am grateful for. But she got it into her head that she was going to learn how to fly, and she met people from Bundles for Britain, and I don't know that they paid her anything, but they got her a license. She studied, learned to fly at Roosevelt Field. Here she is in the middle photograph, joining the Tail Feathers Club. And I found out that that was called that because there was no communication in the plane when you were studying before there were good radios. So the way the instructor told you what to do was he pulled on your shirt tails. And so to join, when you had gotten your license, to join the Tail Feathers Club, you had to clip off a little bit of your tail feathers and tack them up. I found many, many stories about her as she made her trip with her co-pilot around the eastern half of the United States. And some were very helpful and had things that I could learn, and some were hopeless. I also found through the Smithsonian, I found a woman named Dolores Pernaud who had learned to fly at Roosevelt Field at about the same time. So I interviewed her many times, and she told me what it was like. And to me, it was totally terrifying. But you know, doing spins and all the rest of it. So she met my father there. And again, remember, she landed in the United States in January, towards the end of January in 1941. And they got married less than a year later. It was a very fast courtship. And I think that she had realized she wasn't going to marry Joe Kennedy and that she was finding somebody else rather too quickly. He was from a good family in New York, but he was an alcoholic, and it was not a marriage that lasted very long. So that's really the story, and there's obviously a lot more in the book, but I wanted to give you just a sense of the background of finding the things in the book, and I hope we've got time. I haven't really been looking, but I hope we have some time for questions and that you may have some.